Europe, in 1914, believed it was standing at the peak of civilization. Empires ruled vast territories, kings were related by blood, and many thought that war, if it ever came, would be short, glorious, and decisive. What followed instead was 4 years of industrial slaughter that not only destroyed millions of lives, but permanently reshaped the European continent in ways that still define the modern world. This video explores 20 fascinating and often overlooked facts about how World War I transformed Europe, its borders, its societies, its politics, and its very understanding of power and survival. What you are about to hear is not theory, but history written in blood, treaties, ruins, and memories. When the first shots were fired, Europe was dominated by a handful of massive empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched across Central and Eastern Europe. The Ottoman Empire still controlled large portions of southeastern Europe. The Russian Empire ruled from Eastern Europe deep into Asia, and Germany, newly unified, stood as an industrial and military giant. By the time the war ended in 1918, none of these empires would survive in their original form. One of the most dramatic changes brought by World War I was the total collapse of Europe's imperial order. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a fragile mosaic of ethnic groups, languages, and religions, disintegrated under the pressure of military defeat and internal rebellion. Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, Hungarians, and others demanded independence, and for the first time in centuries, Central Europe was redrawn into new nation-states. Austria and Hungary were reduced to small republics, stripped of territory, population, and influence. What had once been a great imperial power became a collection of weakened states struggling to survive. The Ottoman Empire's collapse reshaped southeastern Europe just as dramatically. Territories in the Balkans that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries were reorganized, leading to the expansion of nations like Greece and the creation of new political realities in the region. The war accelerated the end of Ottoman authority in Europe, leaving behind borders that would fuel ethnic tensions and conflicts for generations. Russia's transformation was even more profound. World War I did not simply weaken the Russian Empire, it destroyed it. The immense human and economic cost of the war shattered public confidence in the Tsarist regime. Soldiers deserted, cities starved, and political unrest exploded into revolution. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed, giving birth first to a provisional government and then to the Bolshevik Revolution. Europe now faced something entirely new, the rise of the world's first communist state. This ideological shockwave would influence European politics for the next century. Germany, though not an empire in the traditional sense, also experienced a radical transformation. Defeated, humiliated, and blamed for the war through the Treaty of Versailles, Germany lost territory, colonies, and military power. The Kaiser abdicated, ending centuries of monarchy and turning Germany into a fragile republic. The psychological impact of defeat would haunt German society, creating resentment and instability that would later contribute directly to the rise of Nazism. Another crucial way World War I changed Europe was through the creation of entirely new countries. Poland, erased from maps for over a century, was reborn as an independent nation. Czechoslovakia emerged as a new democratic state in Central Europe. Yugoslavia was created by uniting several South Slavic peoples under one kingdom. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania gained independence as Russian authority collapsed. Europe's map was redrawn almost overnight, but these new borders were often unstable, poorly defined, and deeply contested. These political changes were accompanied by a profound shift in how Europeans understood nationalism. Before the war, nationalism had been an idea mostly embraced by elites and intellectuals. After the war, it became a mass force. Millions of people now identified themselves primarily by nation, language, and ethnicity. While this strengthened national identity in some regions, it also intensified ethnic rivalries, especially in areas where borders did not match population realities. Minorities often found themselves trapped inside states where they were unwanted, setting the stage for future conflicts. World War I also permanently changed Europe's social structure. The war demanded total mobilization, pulling entire societies into the conflict. Millions of men were sent to the front, while women took their places in factories, farms, and offices. For the first time on such a massive scale, women became essential to national survival. This shift accelerated movements for women's rights across Europe. In several countries, including Britain and Germany, women gained the right to vote in the years immediately following the war, a direct consequence of their wartime contributions. The psychological scars left by the war were just as transformative as the political ones. Europe had never experienced destruction on this scale. Entire villages were wiped off the map. Landscapes were permanently scarred by trenches, craters, and unexploded shells. Soldiers returned home traumatized, suffering from what was then called shell shock. This widespread psychological damage changed how Europeans viewed war itself. The romantic image of warfare collapsed, replaced by a grim understanding of industrialized death. Economically, Europe was shattered. The war drained national treasuries, destroyed infrastructure, and disrupted trade networks that had existed for decades. Countries like France and Belgium faced enormous reconstruction challenges, as entire regions had been turned into wastelands. Britain emerged victorious but deeply indebted. Germany faced crippling reparations. Inflation soared, currencies collapsed, and economic instability became the norm rather than the exception. The economic consequences of World War I would directly contribute to the Great Depression just over a decade later. The war also transformed the relationship between citizens and the state. Governments across Europe had taken unprecedented control over economies, industries, and daily life during the conflict. Rationing, censorship, propaganda, and surveillance became common tools. After the war, many of these practices did not disappear. Europeans had become accustomed to powerful central governments capable of controlling society in the name of national survival. This shift paved the way for the rise of authoritarian regimes in the interwar period. Culturally, World War I marked the end of an era. The confidence of the pre-war world, the belief in endless progress, reason, and stability was destroyed. European art, literature, and philosophy took a darker, more cynical tone. Writers, poets, and artists who had lived through the war questioned traditional values and explored themes of disillusionment, chaos, and loss. Movements like Dadaism and modernism reflected a continent struggling to make sense of its own destruction. Perhaps one of the most overlooked changes was how World War I altered Europe's global position. Before 1914, Europe dominated the world economically, politically, and militarily. After the war, that dominance began to fade. The United States emerged as a major global power, while European nations struggled to recover. This shift marked the beginning of the end of European supremacy on the world stage. By 1918, Europe was no longer the confident imperial continent it had been just 4 years earlier. It was fractured, traumatized, and fundamentally changed. Empires had fallen, nations had risen, societies had been transformed, and the seeds of future conflicts had already been planted. And yet, these changes were only the beginning. As the guns fell silent in 1918, Europe did not return to normal life. Instead, the continent entered a fragile and uncertain peace, shaped by loss, resentment, and unresolved tensions. The war had ended, but its consequences now invaded homes, streets, governments, and minds. One of the most profound changes World War I brought to Europe was how ordinary people lived, worked, and understood their place in society. Millions of soldiers returned from the front permanently changed. Many came back physically mutilated, missing limbs, blinded, or disfigured. Others returned with invisible wounds, psychological trauma that society barely understood. Shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, left countless veterans unable to sleep, work, or reintegrate into civilian life. European cities were suddenly filled with wounded men, reminders of a war that refused to fade into memory. Governments struggled to care for these veterans. Pensions were often insufficient, medical systems overwhelmed, and public sympathy slowly eroded as economic hardship deepened. In countries like Germany and Italy, veterans' resentment became fertile ground for extremist movements. Former soldiers, accustomed to discipline, violence, and hierarchy, were drawn to radical political groups that promised purpose, order, and national revival. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, reshaped Europe's political landscape, but also planted the seeds of future disaster. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay massive reparations, and surrender territory. This treaty did not bring reconciliation, it created humiliation. Many Germans viewed it not as peace, but as punishment. This sense of injustice spread through German society, undermining faith in democracy and fueling nationalist anger. France, although victorious, emerged deeply scarred. Large portions of northeastern France had been devastated by trench warfare. Entire towns were destroyed, farmland poisoned, and infrastructure reduced to rubble. France demanded harsh measures against Germany, driven by fear of another invasion. The war hardened French politics, making security the nation's primary obsession. Britain faced a different reality. While spared the physical destruction seen on the continent, it paid a heavy human and economic price. An entire generation of young men was lost. British society struggled with grief and disillusionment. The empire remained vast, but its foundations were weakening. The war exposed Britain's dependence on foreign loans, particularly from the United States, signaling a decline in its global dominance. Across Europe, borders drawn after the war often ignored ethnic, cultural, and historical realities. New nations celebrated independence, but minorities within those states frequently faced discrimination. In Czechoslovakia, Germans and Hungarians found themselves under Czech rule. In Yugoslavia, tensions between Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes simmered beneath the surface. These unresolved ethnic divisions made Europe more unstable than ever. The war also revolutionized political participation. Millions of Europeans who had fought or worked for the war effort demanded a voice in shaping the future. Voting rights expanded dramatically. In many countries, universal male suffrage became standard, and women gained political rights for the first time. Democracy spread across Europe, but it was fragile, inexperienced, and vulnerable to crisis. At the same time, fear of revolution haunted European elites. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia terrified governments across the continent. Workers' strikes, socialist movements, and uprisings erupted in Germany, Hungary, and Italy. In response, conservative forces often supported authoritarian leaders who promised stability at any cost. Democracy, for many, seemed weak compared to strong leadership. Economically, Europe was trapped in a cycle of instability. War debts, reparations, and reconstruction costs strained national budgets. Inflation soared, especially in Germany, where hyperinflation wiped out savings and destroyed the middle class. People carried wheelbarrows of money to buy bread. This economic chaos shattered trust in institutions and radicalized populations. The war also changed the role of propaganda forever. Governments had learned how powerful information control could be. Newspapers, posters, films, and speeches had mobilized entire nations during the conflict. After the war, these tools were not abandoned. Political movements, especially extremist ones, used propaganda to manipulate fear, anger, and hope on a massive scale. Culturally, Europe struggled to process its trauma. War memorials appeared in nearly every town and village, listing names of the dead. These monuments became sacred spaces of collective mourning. Yet beneath the ceremonies and speeches lay a deep sense of loss that words could not heal. The phrase, "the lost generation," captured the feeling that Europe's future had been buried in the trenches. Religion, too, was affected. Many Europeans lost faith, not only in institutions, but in God itself. The brutality of the war raised profound moral questions. How could such destruction exist in a civilized Christian continent? For some, religion offered comfort. For others, it became another casualty of the war. Technological changes driven by the conflict also reshaped civilian life. Advances in medicine, such as plastic surgery and trauma care, emerged directly from battlefield necessity. Aviation, once experimental, became a symbol of modernity. Tanks, machine guns, and chemical weapons demonstrated how technology could turn war into mechanized slaughter. Europeans now understood that future wars would be faster, deadlier, and more total than ever before. The war fundamentally altered Europe's relationship with violence. Before 1914, war had been seen as a tool of diplomacy. After 1918, it was viewed as a threat to civilization itself. Yet paradoxically, Europe became more militarized, not less. Nations rearmed quietly, distrustful of neighbors and haunted by unresolved grievances. Perhaps the most dangerous legacy of World War I was the illusion of peace. Treaties were signed, borders drawn, and institutions like the League of Nations were created to prevent future conflicts. But these measures lacked enforcement power and universal support. The United States withdrew into isolationism. Germany and the Soviet Union were initially excluded. Europe was left trying to police itself while deeply divided. By the early 1920s, Europe looked calm on the surface, but beneath that calm lay economic despair, political extremism, ethnic hatred, and psychological trauma. The continent had survived the war, but it had not healed. Instead, it had been reshaped into something new, more fragile, more volatile, and more dangerous. The Europe that emerged from World War I was not merely wounded, it was ideologically destabilized. The war had shattered trust in monarchies, weakened faith in democracy, and exposed the vulnerability of traditional institutions. Into this vacuum stepped radical ideologies that promised clarity, strength, and national rebirth. The transformations triggered by the Great War did not simply change Europe's borders, they changed how Europeans believed power should be exercised. In Germany, the Weimar Republic was born under the shadow of defeat. From its first days, it faced hostility from both the far left and the far right. Communists attempted uprisings inspired by the Russian Revolution, while nationalist militias, composed largely of embittered veterans, roamed the streets. These paramilitary groups, known as Freikorps, became a defining feature of post-war German society. They normalized political violence and undermined democratic authority. The economic consequences of the war intensified this instability. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s erased personal savings, destroyed pensions, and humiliated the middle class. Teachers, engineers, and civil servants found themselves impoverished overnight. This economic trauma was not forgotten when extremist leaders later blamed democracy, minorities, and foreign powers for Germany's suffering. The roots of radicalization lay directly in the unresolved aftermath of World War I. Italy, although technically on the winning side, felt betrayed by the peace settlements. Promised territories were denied or reduced, creating the idea of a mutilated victory. Italian veterans returned home to unemployment, strikes, and social unrest. Fear of socialist revolution spread among the elite. Into this chaos rose Benito Mussolini, himself a former soldier. He exploited war memories, glorified violence, and promised national revival. Fascism in Italy was not an accident, it was a product of war-induced frustration and fear. Across Eastern Europe, new states struggled to survive. Many lacked stable institutions, experienced leadership, or economic foundations. Surrounded by hostile neighbors and burdened by ethnic tensions, these countries increasingly turned toward authoritarian solutions. Parliaments were dissolved, opposition silenced, and power concentrated in the hands of strong men who claimed that democracy was too weak for such dangerous times. The Soviet Union represented another radical path shaped by World War I. The Bolsheviks used the chaos of war to seize power, then fought a brutal civil war to maintain it. Their victory terrified conservative Europe and inspired revolutionary movements worldwide. Communism became both a threat and an obsession. Governments justified repression, surveillance, and censorship in the name of preventing revolution, further eroding democratic norms. World War I also changed how Europeans viewed violence as a political tool. The war had accustomed an entire generation to death on an industrial scale. For many veterans, violence no longer felt exceptional, it felt normal. Street battles, assassinations, and coups became common in the interwar years. Politics turned brutal, and compromise was increasingly seen as weakness. Another crucial transformation was the collapse of moral authority. Churches, intellectuals, and traditional elites had largely supported the war in 1914. When the slaughter became undeniable, their credibility collapsed. This created space for charismatic leaders who claimed to speak directly for the people, bypassing institutions entirely. Populism flourished in this environment. The League of Nations, created to prevent future wars, symbolized both hope and failure. While it represented a new international ideal, it lacked military power and universal participation. When confronted with aggression, it could protest, but not enforce. Europe's security rested on fragile promises rather than strength, encouraging revisionist states to challenge the status quo. Cultural life reflected this radicalization. Art, literature, and cinema became increasingly political. War stories glorified sacrifice or exposed horror, often fueling nationalist or revolutionary narratives. History itself became a weapon, rewritten to justify claims of victimhood and destiny. Memory of World War I was no longer neutral, it was mobilized. Perhaps the most significant change was psychological. Europeans lived with a sense that another war was not only possible, but inevitable. Peace felt temporary, artificial, imposed. Children grew up hearing stories of trenches, gas attacks, and heroic deaths. The war became mythologized, turning tragedy into justification for future conflict. By the early 1930s, Europe stood at a crossroads shaped entirely by the First World War. The continent had been reorganized, destabilized, and radicalized. Political systems born from the war now struggled to contain the forces it had unleashed. The decisions made in 1919 echoed through every crisis, every election, and every act of aggression. World War I did not end in 1918, it merely changed form. Its legacy lived on in broken economies, wounded minds, and ideologies that promised salvation through strength and unity. And as Europe moved forward, it carried the weight of a war that had taught it how to destroy itself. By the time Europe plunged into the Second World War in 1939, the continent was not entering a new conflict, it was continuing an old one. The First World War had fundamentally rewritten Europe's identity, and its consequences extended far beyond the armistice of 1918. Borders drawn in haste, ideologies born from trauma, and societies shaped by loss ensured that the Great War would define the entire 20th century. One of the most enduring changes was Europe's relationship with power. Before World War I, authority was rooted in monarchies, tradition, and inherited legitimacy. After the war, those foundations were shattered. Kings and emperors disappeared, replaced by fragile republics or authoritarian regimes. Power became something to be seized, defended, and imposed, often through violence. This shift permanently altered European political culture. The war also changed how Europeans understood responsibility and guilt. The concept of collective blame, enforced through treaties and reparations, created a dangerous precedent. Entire nations were punished for the actions of governments and elites. This approach fueled resentment rather than reconciliation, teaching future leaders that peace imposed through humiliation was unstable and temporary. Europe's borders, redrawn after the war, became fault lines rather than solutions. The principle of national self-determination sounded ideal, but reality was far more complex. Millions of people lived as minorities in new states that did not fully accept them. These unresolved tensions became excuses for future invasions, annexations, and ethnic cleansing. The map of Europe created after World War I was less a blueprint for peace than a countdown to future conflict. The war permanently altered Europe's demographic structure. An entire generation of young men was lost. This imbalance affected families, labor markets, and birth rates for decades. Women who had taken on new roles during the war were no longer willing to return entirely to pre-war expectations. While progress was uneven and often resisted, European society could never fully undo this transformation. Militarily, World War I changed the nature of warfare forever. The idea of a short, decisive conflict died in the trenches. Europe learned that modern war meant total mobilization. Economies, industries, civilians, and mines all became targets. This understanding shaped military planning, leading directly into World War II and beyond, influencing doctrines of total war and later Cold War strategies. The psychological legacy of the war was perhaps its most haunting gift. Memory became a battlefield. Nations constructed narratives of heroism, victimhood, and betrayal. These stories were passed down through education, monuments, and propaganda. The First World War became not just history, but identity. How a nation remembered the war determined how it justified future actions. Europe's decline as the center of global power also accelerated. The war exposed Europe's vulnerability and dependence. The United States, and later the Soviet Union, emerged as dominant forces. Europe, once the unquestioned ruler of world affairs, now found itself divided, weakened, and increasingly shaped by external powers. This shift marked the beginning of a new global order. Yet from destruction also came lessons. The sheer scale of suffering forced Europeans to confront the cost of unchecked nationalism and militarism. Institutions aimed at cooperation and integration, though imperfect, were born from this realization. The idea that Europe must find unity to survive can be traced directly back to the catastrophe of World War I. Even today, Europe's political structures, alliances, and fears are echoes of that first global conflict. Debates over borders, sovereignty, nationalism, and collective security all carry the imprint of decisions made over a century ago. The First World War was not just a historical event, it was a turning point that reshaped how Europe sees itself and the world. In the end, World War I changed Europe not in one single way, but in countless interconnected ways. It ended empires, created nations, radicalized politics, transformed society, and redefined war itself. Its legacy is written not only in textbooks, but in the very structure of modern Europe. If you made it to the end of this documentary, leave a comment below with the word trenches to let us know you stayed until the final moment. Tell us what you thought about this video and which fact impacted you the most. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and continue watching the next videos that are appearing on your screen right now, because history doesn't end here, and there are many more untold stories waiting for you.